Welcome to today's Substack Live. I am Dave Keating from Gulfstream Blues, and
I'm Julien Hoes from the French Dispatch. Thanks for joining us today.
And we are doing a quick and dirty recap of what's happened the past couple of days with the EU. I think both me and Julien agree, surrendering to the United States on this quote-unquote deal, which, as we'll talk about, is not a deal in any way, shape, or form, in order to avoid the threatened 30% or even 50% tariffs that the Trump regime was threatening. The EU has agreed to 15% tariffs and a whole lot of other things. So we're going to talk in this Substack Live about what that means for the future of Europe, what that means for the whole relations, I think, between Europe and the United States, how this has implications even bigger than the economy, especially when you look at the context in which this comes immediately following the NATO surrender to the United States, if that isn't a contradiction in terms, because NATO effectively is the United States, but the NATO members, let's say, surrendering to the United States in agreeing a nonsensical, illusory 5% cap, and with the NATO Secretary General calling Donald Trump daddy. We'll talk about how all those things are connected. But let's talk first about what exactly is in this deal. I think it's safe to say that, Julien, for us in the Brussels bubble, it wasn't, it was infuriating, the content of this quote-unquote deal, but it was not surprising, right? We had gotten signals over the summer for many weeks that this was the direction the EU was headed in. We had a kind of a clear mandate given by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, at the European Council summit in June, basically saying just that we need to swallow our pride and accept a quick and dirty deal to get some stability back, some predictability for businesses, because this constant back and forth is hurting the economy and then the markets too much. So we saw this coming. I don't think that softened the blow to actually see it coming when it did it, Julien?
No, and I mean, we had this really weird sort of circus around the discussions with this trade deal where you always had, you had the member states saying what they wanted to say based on what they wanted out of the deal for their industry. In the case of the Germans, it was the automotive industry. You had Maroš Šefčovič, the Commissioner for Trade, who was always saying, oh no, don't worry guys, we're making a deal happen, everything's going to be fine, etc., etc. And I think what really shocked and pissed off pretty much everybody across the board, aside from the leaders in the council who really wanted this deal, was the fact that the EU got absolutely nothing out of this. I mean, the EU, we'll get into the nitty-gritty in a second, but the problem that we have is that the EU has basically been forced to commit something like, $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion in investments in the US with nothing coming back to it. It's being hit by tariffs at the same time. It's forced to buy more military equipment. It's, quote unquote, as part of these trillions, supposed to invest in US energy. And I saw something from Politico where it's supposed to triple its importation of American energy sources. And honestly, I think there was a bit of a whiplash in Brussels, especially, because it feels like a lot of us were lied to about what was being done. And it feels like a lot of us were being lied to and misled by Šefčovič and von der Leyen, because they made it seem like this should be a two-way street, a two-way trade deal. And as you and me have been screaming on social media, we basically become the US's junior partner in every way. I mean, von der Leyen pulled a Merkel. And that's what's really pissing off a lot of people, really.
I mean, that's one of the biggest problems, isn't it? The messaging here, that von der Leyen had the nerve to come out of that meeting on Sunday and say this is the biggest trade deal that's ever been reached. It's not a trade deal.
No.
It's not the biggest. I mean, she's just lying to us or gaslighting us more
Yeah.
precisely. And I think that's been the big problem here. Look, I've seen a lot of people in denial over the past 2 days, kind of big EU fans, kind of deluding themselves into thinking, oh, the EU is playing chess and Donald Trump is playing checkers. And these promises of the energy purchases and the investment purchases aren't binding, and the EU is never really going to do it. And so, ha ha ha, we tricked Trump. And anyway, tariffs are going to hurt the importing country more than the exporting country. I mean, this stuff, this is delusional. This is the ultimate in cope I've ever heard. Because we can assure you, people who have been following this, the EU is not playing chess here. And I think the thing that people need to understand is that on Liberation Day, Donald Trump said he was going to impose 20% tariffs on the European Union, claiming those were reciprocal. The EU said they're not reciprocal. This is a made-up, arbitrary number, and they took it to the WTO. They said these tariffs are illegal. You can't just arbitrarily slap tariffs on countries. For instance, in the case of Brazil, Trump out openly saying he's slapping them with 50% tariffs because he doesn't like that they're prosecuting the attempted coup from a couple years ago. That is illegal under the rules-based international trade order. What the EU has done here is committed to not challenging this. So the EU has just completely dismantled the global rules-based trade order, completely dismantled the WTO, because they've said, we're going to accept tariffs that we have already said are completely arbitrary and basically illegal. That means everything's legal now. That means there are no trade rules, thanks to what Ursula von der Leyen did on Sunday. And the really crazy thing about this number is in June, when we had Merz urging a quick and dirty deal, we were talking about 10%. And that was an open debate in June, whether the EU should accept 10% like the UK did in the UK's own surrender deal. And now we've ended up with 15%, even higher than what the UK accepted, and only 5% lower than that 20% amount that the EU said was so unconscionable a couple months ago when Donald Trump proposed it as part of Liberation Day. So you can make the economic argument that the tariffs will hurt American consumers more than European consumers, and so that this is worth it for the EU to swallow this indignity because in the long run, this is going to hurt the U.S. economy. The reality is this will hurt consumers on both sides. This will result in inflation both in the U.S. and Europe. It will hurt European companies. The only person who benefits from this surrender is Donald Trump, because it solidifies his power over Europe and it solidifies his strategy of bullying other countries on the global stage.
And there's also a really interesting part of this that I've not seen discussed too much, but I think is quite telling of what they're trying to do. So, for example, some of the exemptions that we're seeing are, aircraft parts, aircraft, some chemicals, and in particular, semiconductor equipment. Now, with the fact that Europe technically has an advantage when it comes to certain semiconductor equipment, when it comes to the treatment of these, semiconductors with UV rays and this kind of thing, which is mostly done out of the Netherlands because only they have the technical know-how. You have the US that's trying to actively build up its semiconductor industry, which we're trying to do as well. That's going to keep importing as much of the equipment as it can on zero tariffs until it doesn't need to, and is going to eventually slap us with tariffs on that too. And I mean, also one of the biggest things that people aren't really talking about is that, one, the US is trying to force the EU to remove non-tariff barriers on agricultural exports, which means that basically the US is still trying to strong arm the EU into lowering its standards for agri products, which isn't good for us. And on top of that, the tariffs on European steel and aluminium still haven't gone down either. So, some of our biggest exports are still getting absolutely hammered because the US is still basically acting as if it's in some sort of trade war with us. And the really interesting thing is, I don't know if you saw the picture of the negotiating teams after the deal was signed, and you look at the trade experts on the EU side, and
They look
would
defeated.
think you
The
would think that someone
the
shot Sabine
experts,
Wayans.
not
Dot.
Shevchevich and von der Leyen, who are putting on totally fake
Yeah,
smiles, but Sabine Weyland, who really knows what she's doing, does not
yeah.
look happy, right?
She looks like von der Leyen just shot her dog in front of her. I mean, it's absolutely outstanding. Like, you've got that one expert whose name I don't know on the far left of the picture who looks like she's trying to put on a fake smile, but nobody looks happy except for the
Yeah.
politicians, which is
Yeah, I mean
not a good sign.
it's a very illustrative photo because it shows exactly who won there and who lost, and that you
Yeah.
really did lose. I mean, it looked like the Treaty of Versailles with the victorious powers sitting next to the defeated powers. I think what's also important to point out here is that, so according to reporting by the FT yesterday, Donald Trump is now saying that we have this deadline of Friday for when supposedly the 30% tariffs on the EU were going to kick in. That was the stated reason why we had to do this, why we had to surrender. We had to surrender to 15% tariffs because Donald Trump was threatening to put in place 30% tariffs, which would be devastating. Completely ignore, here's the complete disconnect from the people I'm hearing today defending this deal and saying, oh, but the tariffs are going to hurt the American consumer more than the European consumer. Then do you honestly think that Donald Trump would have gone ahead with his 30% tariffs on Friday if it
Mm.
really hurts the American consumer more than the European consumer, which it does? No. Taco, Trump, always eat chickens. Ow. Who really thought that he was going to go through with that on Friday? Apparently Ursula von der Leyen, because there's
Yeah.
no other reason to have agreed to this. And what's crazy is now Trump is saying that those countries that didn't reach deals by Friday are going to face a tariff of, get ready, 15% or
Wow.
maximum 20%. So basically, the EU has surrendered here for nothing because apparently, if they hadn't reached a surrender deal, Friday would have come and either the deadline would have been yet again extended or Donald Trump would have slapped on 15% tariffs, which is the amount they agreed to anyway. So they've basically just committed to accepting the legality of 15% for no reason. Because let's say a deal wasn't reached and Donald Trump had slapped on 15% tariffs on everyone who didn't reach a deal, maybe 20%. The EU could have challenged that at the WTO. Now they can't.
Yeah. And there was also a really interesting thing where, I mean, for example, the only people who really were happy about this deal were those who have either huge imports and like some very specific exports, like, ASML in the Netherlands and Germany with its automobile sector and everything. But no, you're right. I mean, literally, it wasn't even 12 hours after that Trump announced that everybody was getting the 15%. And look, I think it's quite clear that neither of us thinks that von der Leyen's a very good commission president. I mean, every time we see each other, we spend half our time talking about von der Leyen. So, But, I mean, the US we're importing 350 billion euros worth of things in general from the US, right? If we slap imports on tariffs on those, the US is going to suffer as well. And the problem is that Trump keeps putting himself in these situations where he basically needs everybody to bail himself out. He's like the ultimate Nepo baby. He's the kid who makes mistakes in his blue book and ends up having to beg for his dad's friend to get him out of trouble with, his boss or something. And it's one of these really, really, really bizarre situations where we have so much leverage, but for some reason our leadership is absolutely terrified of actually doing anything. I mean, you can see this from, you have the very typical France and everybody else deal with this situation, right? Where France was saying we need to fight. And we can fight. We just need to actually be able to absorb some of the pain and learn to start trading blows. Because, there is a problem with the EU. And I've got a piece I'm releasing later today or tomorrow, where it's very clear that we don't actually have any pain tolerance as a union.
Yeah.
Or, particularly on the German side of this situation.
Well, I want to be fair to VDL here because, it's not like she stepped in and she said, no, we're surrendering. And all the national leaders are like, no, we want to be strong. This is the mandate she was given, most notably by Germany's Friedrich Merz and Italy's Giorgia Meloni. Macron made some protest, but I didn't see him really putting his neck out on this. So this is an act of surrender by all of Europe's leaders collectively. We need to remember that. That being said, if Ursula von der Leyen was a strong president, she could have led a resistance. She could have gone in there in the council and said, look, I know the short-term instinct here is to panic and to try to alleviate the short-term instability. But if we do this, if we surrender, we are causing ourselves more problems in the long term. She didn't do
Yeah.
that because she's not a leader. She's a follower. She follows the instructions given by the member states. And you could, some intergovernmental fans would say that's her role. She's a glorified civil servant and she should just be executing the wishes of the member states. I don't agree with that. You don't agree with that. The European Commission president, has a bully pulpit if they choose to use it. And previous Commission presidents, like Jacques Delors, have chosen to use it. She has not chosen to use it. But if you're one of those intergovernmentalists, as opposed to federalists like us, who is saying that, well, she's just a glorified civil servant, then why is she sitting there next to Donald Trump? Why are we even doing this? Why are we entrusting the commission to carry out this hugely high stakes and very political, not technical exercise if the intergovernmentalists are saying, well, she's a nobody and she's just a glorified civil servant? Why is she sitting in that chair? And then who do you propose to sit in that chair instead of her?
Yeah, and there's also this issue where I saw one or two people, in between the deluge of all the MAGA people laughing at Europe and the Russians saying, haha, you guys suck. I saw a few federalists who were saying, yeah, but von der Leyen starts picking fights with people. It's going to create a constitutional crisis. We're going to have to start talking about treaties again. Good. Do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do it.
I mean, again, she has the bully pulpit. If she went in there, look, I'm not telling her to walk in there in Scotland and punch Donald Trump in the face. But if she had, let's say, said, I'm not going, he can come here. Or if she had basically come out with a speech and said, we are not accepting a deal that is unfair for Europeans. I am fighting for Europeans. That's the bully pulpit. Then those national leaders are going to have to say, no, I don't want to fight for Europeans. I want to fight for Americans. I want to fight for Donald Trump. Make them say that. But when you have a coward in office, as Ursula von der Leyen is, then you're never going to get that bully pulpit used, and the national leaders are not going to feel any pressure. And even Macron isn't, again, like I said, not really sticking his neck out on this. Those that were criticizing the deal, the criticism was so light. I mean, Pedro Sanchez saying, I accept the deal, but I don't do so enthusiastically. Like, wow, what a profile in courage. I mean somebody say something. The only person who said something was Bayrou, the Prime Minister of
French
France.
Prime Minister, But I mean, to be fair, there's one thing that I think is important to note. So, I mean, there was only, I think, 4 member states actually came out and said they were really happy with this. So you had Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Netherlands. Ireland is always going to say, whatever means they have to pay less taxes, cool, fuck it, whatever. The Netherlands as well is just one of the frugals, so they always try to save money however they can, Germany and Italy as well. The fact that you had Orban against this deal, who said, he was saying, they want von der Leyen's lunch or whatever there was, or she capitulated. You had, I think the Romanians said this was embarrassing. You had the Scandinavians who said, what the hell? And also, there's something that's quite important. I think it's there's also a political element to this too. So I still stand by my idea that von der Leyen is constantly trying to play to her German constituency and especially to the EPP, because she's still trying to figure out what she's going to do in 3 or so years when she ends up moving on to the next stage of failing upwards. I mean, at this stage, she may become secretary of the UN, quite frankly, because this is what she does. Same kind of failures that you saw when she was the military minister in Germany, same kind of issues you've seen in all of her posts and all of her campaigns. There's always some kind of mess and she just keeps falling upwards. There's something that's quite interesting when it comes to the French position, however, which it sounds like I'm making excuses for my country and my person, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's very interesting how the French have basically taken the most diplomatic avenue to criticizing this deal and von der Leyen. So like you had Benjamin Haddad and you had the French minister, Saint Laurent, whatever he's called, who basically said that, okay, this deal is okay for now, but then it was followed by 4 paragraphs of criticisms for the deal and the fact that the whole thing wasn't great. And the fact that you had Bayrou coming out and saying that it's a capitulation, considering how weak Beyrou's government is now, and they're about 3 steps away from another election, or we are 3 steps away from another election in France, I think the fact that everybody's coming out quite aggressively, including our MP who's here in Brussels or in the Benelux and who is in the European Affairs Committee in the Assemblée Nationale, I think Macron's trying to play the diplomat and not trying to come out and just, sucker punch von der Leyen. Because there's a sense of responsibility from the Franco-German engine and the fact that we don't try to harpoon what is effectively the emblem of European unity, whatever. And he's letting his team do it for him. Because I have to say, I don't think there's a single person in the pro-European side of the French political spectrum that isn't absolutely shellacking this deal. I mean, I think this is one of the rare opportunities where there's been actual genuine unity across the board in Paris, sorry, with regards to European affairs. There is not a single party that is actually supporting this deal. And in fact, this is starting to look a lot like the Mercosur shit show, where pretty much everybody is saying this is a bad deal for us. Sure, there's some good parts,
I mean,
there's
you want
some
to say to those
exemptions, blah,
people,
blah,
guys,
blah.
this is what a bad deal looks like. Mercosur's a pretty good deal. I mean,
Compared to Mercosur, this is a fucking disaster. But
uh,
no, it's. I think there's something quite interesting happening where you're seeing really again this barrier between those who really want a strong Europe, who at least don't want a subservient Europe, which somehow is everybody in the French political spectrum, which surprises even me. But I mean, and then you've got everybody else who is just happy being coddled by the Americans and just wants to stay in this nice little shiny space where, they get to have their friends and they get to have the nice trade deals. Because I mean, even Russia said this was a shitty deal. Lavrov was talking about the fact that it's damaging to, well, obviously he's complaining about the energy prices and the fact that no one's buying Russian gas and oil anymore, which, good. But also the way that European investments in industry and agriculture are now going to just be leaving the EU and going to the US now. Because the money from the EU side is all just going that way. And even if Russia has some reasons to stand in between the US and the EU relationship and all this kind of stuff, the fact that we know that Lavrov is telling the truth and that he's right should be triggering alarm bells everywhere. I mean, to be fair, after they realized that there was such a big backlash against this deal, I think you saw the European leaders basically just disappeared.
yeah.
Like
I mean,
that
it's
was
interesting because the initial reactions were positive, generally from national governments. The media got this way wrong too. I mean, that Politico article on Sunday calling this a triumph for von der Leyen, I couldn't believe that.
and they changed the title in the
Yeah.
space of an hour.
So I think I know what happened there. I noticed that those changes happened late at night. That would have been U.S. time. Things over there are really being dictated in Washington now under this one Politico strategy. I imagine that came from the D.C. office overnight, those changes. I don't think out of malice or some kind of evil plot. I think on the American side, they just don't get it. They wouldn't have understood how angry this would have made Europeans. This is the problem when we have our media here in Brussels run by DC-based organizations, but that's a whole other topic. But I wanted to go back to, you brought up how Orban was criticizing the deal, and I think that's made some pro-Europeans, particularly in the UK, who are whatever, aren't always the most informed, let's say, wanting to say, how dare you criticize the EU? The EU is playing chess here, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, though, we know why Orban's doing it, because the other defense being made of this deal is that, look, it's embarrassing, it's bad, but we have to do it for Ukraine. We have to do it so that the U.S. continues defending Ukraine and sticks with NATO because of the military protectorate. That is a horrible argument for multiple.
Such a bad argument. Jesus.
One is that, okay, we know that the NATO has always been a military protectorate that effectively makes its European members vassal states of the United States. But that's always been implicit. This is making it explicit. This is explicitly tying America's military protection of Europe with European economic subservience and subordinance to the United States. That's extremely troubling. And it's extremely troubling if somebody is defending that as some kind of permanent system. Now, making the argument that we have to do this in the meantime until Europe becomes militarily independent, Europe isn't making any steps on that. All they're doing is obeying the American commands to spend more, but they're still doing so in a NATO framework, which is completely controlled by the Americans. And I want to say, and I know this won't be a popular opinion with everybody, but if you're telling me that we as Europeans need to accept economic subservience and servitude to the United States in order to keep Ukraine free, in order to keep Donbass and Crimea out of the hands of the Russian Empire, that we in Europe should make ourselves vassals of the United States so that Ukraine doesn't become vassals of Russia. Fuck that. I mean, what kind of argument is that? And what European out there is going to say, yes, I am totally happy to become a slave of the United States in order so that Ukraine doesn't become a slave of Russia. We're going to become part of the American empire so that Ukraine doesn't become part of the Russian empire.
Yeah.
Who would support that? What kind of argument is that? So I just find this reasoning that I've been seeing on social media that we need to do this for the sake of Ukraine, completely undignified, completely stupid, but also that is a losing strategy because the people of Europe will not accept that.
Yeah, and there's also this really weird thing. You and I have talked about this a lot, both on this platform and in real life, where every time that someone tries to do a big push to develop the military capabilities or the industry, and usually it ends up being France, because France is probably the most militant of the member states, everybody loses their shit about becoming a protectorate of France or having to rely on the French military industrial complex or whatever bollocks that they come up with. And then you always end up being like, oh no, we can't follow the French, and we're all going to stop going hon 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 every day and all this bullshit, right? And we don't want to buy French equipment, and we don't want to buy French Rafales or whatever, in blah, 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 etc., etc. And then suddenly when the Americans do worse, everybody starts jumping like a dog looking for his treat, and it's absolutely fucking mind-blowing. I mean,
But it's the mentality of Europeans that they have grown up in a culture that worships America, that is naturally subservient to America. This is the subject of the book I'm working on right now, which is hopefully going to be coming out in the autumn, that this is a problem with the European brain, a problem with the European mindset, that this servitude is baked in culturally on this continent. So let's talk about what's next here, because I did promise that in the title. And so we've been complaining for a half an hour, so we should talk about solutions maybe. And by the way, for those of you watching, if you want to put in questions or comments down below, I saw one comment come in. I'll read those out at the end, even just comments. But so we have this deal in place, but it's not really a deal. It's like a handshake, right? There is no written text. And just like with the UK's deal, you'll see what plays out over the next months. I mean, there's been no more specificity in the UK deal over the past months than there's been with the EU deal over the past 2 days. And what we've seen is that there was a hugely different interpretation on the US side and the UK side. And we're already seeing that when the White House put out their summary of what they think was just agreed to, it completely contradicts what the Commission was telling us yesterday. The US apparently thinks the EU has agreed to give Washington a veto power over EU legislation when it comes to digital legislation. Washington thinks that the EU just agreed to bend its agriculture rules for Washington's wishes, and the Commission is insisting, no, that didn't happen. So we're not committed to anything right now. That handshake by President von der Leyen doesn't actually really commit the EU to anything. Now, let's assume that on Friday, Donald Trump does impose some kind of blanket 15 to 20% tariffs on all the countries that didn't sign deals. To me, that says that the EU should renege on this, that actually, if they see that, okay, we're going to get 15, 20% anyway, then deals off. This is still possible to back out of. Now, looking at the reaction of national leaders, I don't see the political will on the part of national governments to back out of this, so I don't think that's a likely scenario. But this isn't set in stone, and we should keep that in mind, right?
Yeah, and again, this is where the EU experts are quite useful. So, I mean, this does still have to be voted on by the council, technically, and the council can nuke it if there's enough resistance from the public and there's enough of an excuse that this is a bad deal. Now, there is a train of thought that this was an initial deal to see how far the US would go in its behavior and that everybody's going to go, actually, you know what, screw that. We're going to trump at the bit and just pick a fight. But the reality is, it depends on how consistent the negative reaction is. And as far as I can see, it's starting to peter out a little bit, where people vented their frustrations and they're getting a bit mad. But I mean, there's a few things here that also played into it. So, for example, a lot of people have said that the commitments to investments aren't actually really feasible. And anyway, it's looking likely that the EU, sorry, is going to just repackage what they're already investing into the US to meet these commitments. So, for example, there was an argument that actually already there's slightly north of $600 billion of investments being made by EU companies regarding certain things. So, for example, following the tariff announcements back in February, a lot of EU car companies already committed to several millions and billions of blah, 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 whatever. Same with semiconductors, same with tech. But what should be coming after, and just to come back to what you were talking about on the military side and the military equipment, especially when it comes to Ukraine and trying to safeguard that kind of thing, the EU member states need to just start investing in factories and jobs. I mean, it's really that simple. I mean, okay, don't get me wrong. Also, what I'm going to say is conditional on the fact that we have the single investment market and all this kind of thing and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, we need to start creating war bonds. We need to start creating stronger investment capabilities in Europe for, you know, commercial investors and professional investors. We need to actually start creating structures where we can start using the money and the investment capacity and even the expertise that we have in Europe to actually stop being so dependent on everybody else and start developing our own capabilities. I mean, for example, I think between you and me, we'd both start investing a lot more heavily in war bonds for European war manufacturing, right? Because we know that this is what we need to do. And, you know, even if it's not popular, we still need to actually start being able to fund and producing equipment for Ukraine rather than being dependent on the US and being, pardon my French, but Trump's little bitch because we need to keep Donbass out of Russian hands, right?
Yeah.
Like, and we have such a big wealth of power and even financial, we're the biggest market in the world.
The
And
problem, though, is that the politicians, the European leaders,
yeah,
we're the biggest market in the world, but Europeans don't know it. The Europeans out there on the streets don't understand their own power because they've never been told their own power. And so the European leaders aren't facing public pressure to stand up to the United States, to use these economic the weight of the European Union, because let's be honest, people out there are not even really paying attention. And that's the problem. So if you're watching this video and this is all making you angry, remember, Ursula von der Leyen, yes, she was not elected by the European people, but she was indirectly elected by EU citizens through their national leaders. And those are the people you need to put pressure on. So if you're angry about this trade deal, the number one person you need to contact is your national government, as your national MP, who would then put pressure on the government, preferably somebody from the governing party. But you can also put pressure on your MEP, your member of the European Parliament. They are more naturally against this deal. It's a little unclear whether they have any power here to actually resist this, but couldn't hurt. Contact your MEP also. But, Ursula von der Leyen, it is not the problem here. She's a symptom of the problem.
she's a part of the problem.
I mean, she's not she's a problem. She's not the problem. The problem is the national leaders that put her in that office. She's a reflection of their cowardice, their lack of vision, but their cowardice and lack of vision comes from the lack of engagement by EU citizens on these European issues. And as long as Europeans remain so indifferent to their own future, their own fate, as long as they're so happy to be ruled by the United States, then their leaders will reflect that. The problem we have to remember is collective on this continent. It's not Ursula von der Leyen's fault. It's not even individual national leaders' fault. It is the people of this continent who are not engaged, who are not paying attention, who are not embracing their own dignity and their own power. And we need to change that mindset here, or else we're just going to keep being in this situation over and over and over, and Europe will be a vassal of the United States forever.
Yeah, and I mean, but to be honest, I disagree that von der Leyen isn't the problem because, to be honest, and this is one thing that I'm quite happy about the actual reaction to all of this, is that for decades you've been talking about the need to build this European policy, this really a European sense. And while a lot of people aren't actually quite aware of what's going on, the people who are at least a tiny bit aware and who watch Euronews on Saturday mornings or whatever, pissed. And this makes me very happy. One, because I'm not a fan of von der Leyen anyway, but two, because it means that people are actually paying attention to what's happening and that
I
they're
mean, I
actually
think that
engaging with the politics, you know?
when the amount of heat that von der Leyen is getting here is appropriate, and she, the buck stops with her. She
Yeah,
signed the deal, and
yeah.
so if people
Or
are
shook the
angry, they
hand.
should absolutely take it out on her. And sure, let's impeach her. I'd be for that. Like this
Oh
is.
yeah, I'm so down for that. VDL out, put the hashtag everywhere, guys. Just go for it.
But the problem is, like we've talked about before, let's say she was impeached, then we're just maybe going to get someone worse. The problem is in the council. The problem is the type of person that the national leaders are willing to put in that presidential seat. But if the European public shows that, look, we expect our EU president to stand up for us as Europeans over the entrenched power of America, national leaders will get that message. And so maybe they wouldn't appoint someone worse. Maybe that message will have been clear. If it's clear that von der Leyen was impeached, let's say, like, for some weird reason, that vote of no confidence succeeded earlier this month and she was ejected for her Pfizer text, which would have been stupid, no lesson would have been learned, right? Then
No.
she'd just be replaced with somebody even worse. If there is a clear consequence of her signing this deal, and we have 6 months now, thanks to stupid far right people, before we could table another vote of no confidence. But if she is effectively impeached because of her signing that deal, the message is clear. The message is clear to the national leaders that your people will not tolerate this. They expect you to be loyal to them first, to Europeans first, and Americans as a distant foreign power.
And
But
I will
people need to ask for it.
and I will quickly run in that there was an alternative path back after the elections where a certain French president put forward a certain savior of the ECB and the Eurozone, Mario Draghi, as a potential Commission president. And to be honest, I'm very much a guy who's on Team Draghi, and I think you know what, Paolo, I agree with you 100%. I'm Team Draghi, and look, we've got a guy who basically created a blueprint for how the European Union could come out of this malaise and actually become a geopolitical power. The Germans poo-pooed the idea pretty much immediately and basically took a shredder to the whole thing. Maybe we need to actually start thinking about listening to the guy who knows what he's talking about, who created an entire roadmap for this whole thing, who's saying a lot of what all of us pro-Europeans have been saying for about a year now or longer. And maybe, look, all I'm going to say is that we need to stop with this Merkel-style leadership in European politics and national politics and member state politics, whatever. We need to start bringing more dynamic politics. I mean, look, one of the reasons why France came out of its malaise after like decades of being a bit, the weaker sibling in the Franco-German relationship, and even in the EU situation, was because we had a president who came through and just took blended everything and mixed things up and improved the investment situation in Europe. Mario Draghi's report, and I encourage everybody to go and read the report, even if it's a bit long, it's really interesting. You have pretty much a similar agenda just on a European level. More investments into military, into tech, into separate industries, blah, blah, blah. Completing certain projects that have been in the quagmire for decades, such as the single investment union and all this kind of, and finalizing the Eurozone and creating all these instructions and these structures and these tools that will actually get us out of this mess. Because, look, von der Leyen's not changing anything specific, right? Half of what she's been doing recently that's been, halfway positive, she's had forced on her by the member states. I mean, look at the deregulation drive. Von der Leyen was never going to do this on her own. The Green Deal, von der Leyen was never going to do that on her own.
Mhm.
The defense funding, that did not come from von der Leyen. That none of the big initiatives have been coming from von der Leyen. They've been forced on her by separate actors, and she just sits there with a smile on her face saying, "Oh, we're doing a great job, ha ha ha," pat myself on the back, right? Von der Leyen isn't really doing anything. And to be honest, one of the big issues that we have, and again, we say this every single time we meet, Dave, and we need to meet under better circumstances sometimes, is von der Leyen is, yes, she's a symptom of the big issue. She represents the issue quite clearly, and we need to reform the way the institutions work. We can't keep having all of these different presidents. We need to have, unify the council and the commission president, make it a unified position, make a slightly more democratic structure there. If that's direct voting, or if that's a slightly clearer way of the member states selecting this based on the votes and, clarifying certain methods and procedures. But yeah, I mean, look, Draghi should be replacing von der Leyen, in my opinion, because, firstly, von der Leyen's not really doing anything aside from making us look dumb. And on top of that, what? The perfect way out of the situation? Trigger Article 7 on Hungary, reform the treaties, kick von der Leyen out, put Mario Draghi in her place. We're a global superpower in 2 years.
I mean,
That's
that's a
my.
fantasy that I
Oh,
would
yes, 100%
totally
a
sign up
fantasy.
to. But
I'm drinking Coke.
maybe we could quickly take these comments and questions that have come in. But yeah, to Paulo's question that you addressed there, which is why can't Draghi replace von der Leyen? The question is, why isn't he there in the first place? Because he's too good, because he's too strong.
Well,
and the national leaders don't want anyone in there who would challenge their power. And that's why
especially
he's
Maloney.
with von der Leyen. Yeah.
Especially Maloney.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, why can't he? Because he's too good. So there was another question here it's also from Paulo. What happened to the services leverage over the US? So the two big bazookas here that the EU had to use was a tax on services, which is complicated but doable, but also this new anti-coercion instrument that is now law. The Commission already made it clear, the member states already made it clear in June that they were not really willing to go down this route, particularly for both things were kind of the nuclear option. They were considered a major escalation. I think, and I assume, Julien, you also agree that they should have been used in this situation, that if Donald Trump had gone ahead with, let's say, that the EU should have said no to this deal, that the EU waited to see if Donald Trump would have gone ahead with 30% tariffs on Friday. Personally, I don't think he would have, because the market reaction would be too bad. But let's say that he did, then the EU should then step in with taxes on services, which the EU has an imbalance with in the US. That's roughly equal to the imbalances on goods, which Trump is always talking about the other way around, and the anti-coercion instrument, because this is clearly extortion. So what happened to it is that the Commission basically dropped it from consideration because the national governments dropped it from consideration.
And there's something quite interesting is that if you go back to, I think it was somewhere around February or March, you would start hearing, or you heard all the time about this famous EU trade bazooka, which is the anti-coercion measure where they were going to tax services at like 50% or something. But I think the Commission probably did a calculation and realized that that's actually, you take a big hit. Another avenue was also the tech tariffs and on, social media, the gaffers and all this kind of stuff. The problem is certain big member states, cough Germany, were always saying, no, we can't do that because we're actually going to lose revenue based on this. And it became a whole shit show. So it's, the Commission chicken out, basically.
So I think the last question here, which is someone just labeled as French follower, and this is a really good question because I saw this a lot from France, from people in France on social media over the past day. I'm previously pro-EU, but genuine question now. What's the point of staying in the EU as France now? The main argument of the EU is to gain leverage against other great powers, but the EU capitulates every 2 months. What's the point? So I completely understand this frustration, and you're absolutely right to ask what's the point, and that's why in my Substack that I wrote on Sunday, I said that von der Leyen was basically undermining the whole purpose, the whole raison d'etre of the EU by not using its strength here, because the citizens will ask, well, what's the point of this? Because we ended up doing the exact same surrender as the UK. But that's what's important. The UK left the EU and they accepted the exact same surrender. But I want to point something out. The UK media completely bought that surrender. They completely accepted it. The narrative in the UK was that that was great news. Hooray, Keir Starmer. Watching that from Brussels, I was really shocked. And the only conclusion I could reach is they realized they really have no choice. So
Yeah.
in the UK, this wasn't even a debate. They had to surrender, and everyone just accepted that and moved on. Here in the EU, we're not accepting this. People are pissed.
Yeah.
And they realized that there was an alternative, and the UK didn't have an alternative. So if France was outside of the European Union, yeah, you could say they would have ended up in the same place because they would have surrendered, but there wouldn't have even been the possibility to not surrender. So we
Yeah.
can't give up on the power of a united Europe and the power of the EU in order to protect Europeans from hostile foreign powers. The fact that it's not being used correctly or courageously enough by our current European leaders is not a reason to completely give up on the idea. Would you agree, Jadil?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a similar connection to be made to, for example, I mean, look at what we went through with Sarkozy, for example, where Sarkozy made several bad deals when it came to the Georgia situation, to dealing with Russia and all this kind of things. And we need to think about the fact that basically being part of the European Union gives us a lot of leverage. It gives us a lot of power. And it's also not only with relation to the external situation, but also internally, because we have to remember that why the EU, it's all about, values, cooperation, engagement internally within the European Union. And also, we need to remember that a lot of this is about maintaining peace on the continent, as well as engaging in prosperity. I agree with Dave that, to be honest, we need to stay in the EU anyway, because look, what the hell are we going to do outside of the EU? At least we have partners that we can disagree with, and we don't get invaded like Ukraine was, right? And a big part of what we're getting out of this is economic security, because sure, look, we just ate dirt when it came to the US deal or the US agreement, which I'm 90% sure is going to get nuked in the council. But we need to remember that this is also about being with like-minded countries, working with like-minded countries, ensuring that we can continue to develop our industries, our markets, our way of life, our standards of living, and working with like-minded countries. Look, in the grand scheme of things, trade deals, it's small stuff. It's really small stuff.
Yeah.
Day to day, the fact that we can travel between member states freely, the fact that we can have a nice American like Dave living with us and being European and hanging out with us and agreeing with us. Thanks, Dave, for the solidarity. And the fact that we can actually all work together pretty freely. That's why we stay in the European Union.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna do the weird far right or far left thing saying no, the structures don't work for us, blah, blah, because they work for us very well. And to be honest, if there's an interest, I could probably even do some kind of Substack Live where I go into this a bit more in depth about why the EU is good for France, even if this deal is dog shit. And look, you tell me if you guys want, but it's useful. Mohammed, I see that there's another question coming.
I just want to say also on that, that's a very good point, that this, solidarity and standing up to global superpowers is one good reason for the EU. It's not the only good reason. There's
Yeah.
the single market. There are so many things about being in the European Union that benefit individual Europeans. Europe would not have the economy that it does today without the European Union. So yes, it's frustrating that the EU is not using its strength in numbers here on this issue. However, that's not the only positive thing about the EU. Also, I
Yeah.
saw this guy, I won't say his name, but a popular French commentator on Twitter saying that, basically acting like this was being imposed on the European people by the European Union. That is a nonsense argument. This is the
Yeah.
national governments that gave instructions to the European Union. The European Union is Europe. The European Union is the Europeans. It's not some kind of weird thing that the EU decided on its own. This deal did not happen because because the EU exists, this deal happened in spite of the EU existing. And that's really important to point out. You can't
Yeah.
blame the EU for this as some kind of foreign, some kind of external force. We have to blame all of us. All of us here in Europe are collectively responsible for this because this is our government. This is a democracy.
Yeah.
And the European indifference to developing strong, sovereign, unified power on this continent is the problem, not the EU, as I saw some French commentators arguing. Do you want to read out this last question or
Yeah,
comment?
sure. And okay, so I think you need to factor in the Ukraine question and why the EU has temporarily capitulated. If the EU at this time did not appease the clown in DC, he would immediately pull out of supporting Ukraine, and the EU has still not figured out how to support Ukraine without the US. Okay, so the
We talked
Ukraine
about this before.
question, yeah, we talked about this a bit earlier, but the reality is, I mean, my opinion is that I think Trump has, and even though his team are very anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia, blah, 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 because it fits into their weird, concert of Europe view of politics on the continent, blah, blah, blah. I think that they've realized that Putin is taking them for a ride. I think Trump is getting more and more angry at the fact that Putin is doing what he's doing. And I think that the fact that Trump's wife is riding him pretty hard regarding the Ukraine situation is changing minds.
I'm kind of skeptical about whether that's a real thing.
No, I'm skeptical too, but I mean, it seems to be going in that direction, and I don't think the US has realized at what point they're being mocked. And there's something that you need to remember about these far right actors in Washington, here in Brussels. They're very weak, and they're very weak egotistically. So if they're being mocked, they take that very badly. Now, on the EU side, we need to remember that the EU has actually put more money into Ukraine than the US. I think the EU has put something like, I can't remember the figures exactly, I'll look them up now quickly, but they've actually put in 2 or 3 times more than the US in terms of raw numbers. And the biggest issue that they have now is that a lot of what's being put into Ukraine is the EU buying equipment from the US and sending it over to the Ukrainians, either the new equipment or old equipment that they had, but they're replacing with purchases from the US. This was the same on the Joe Biden. This is what's happening right now on the Trump. And the reality is, yes, the EU is still struggling to find a way out of the situation, find a way to support the Ukrainians more strongly. But this takes time. This is why you're seeing this discussion around the, coalition of the willing, potential boots on the ground to ensure a ceasefire, trying to build up, regimental training structures in the EU for Ukrainians, blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to have a look very quickly on the support for Ukraine figures, just to see, because there are charts. So, okay, no, it's not 2 or 3 times more, sorry, but the US has put in 65 billion and the EU has put in 72 billion. So there is more going in from the EU side than the US side. But the EU wouldn't be able to go much further, I believe, right now because the structures aren't there for the time being, which is why they can do things.
And if the US said you can't buy our military equipment anymore, there's nothing for the EU to say.
Yeah, exactly. This is a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everybody for your comments and questions. I think, yeah, as we said before, the important thing here to know is we're not powerless. Ursula von der Leyen is not our emperor. And if there
Thank God.
thank God, if there is a big backlash against this amongst the public, it won't happen. It's just a handshake for the moment. Like I said, I'm not confident that national leaders are going to have the courage to step in and say this is continental suicide. However, the reason they won't do that is because the people out there are not pressuring them to do so. So we need to pressure them. I know I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here in terms of the people watching this, but talk to your family, talk to your friends, and tell them all to write to their MP and tell them how angry they are about this deal, because that's the deal, because that's the only way that this is going to change, this pattern.
And tell them to subscribe to our Substacks. That's also very important.
Also, that's important. All right. Thanks, everybody. And try to enjoy your summery week despite all of the bad news.
Yeah. Yeah, take care, guys. Have a nice holiday.
Take
And
care, everybody.
thanks for the support.
Bye bye.
Ciao.